Britain's economy is larger than it has ever been. The stock market is near record highs. London remains one of the wealthiest cities on earth. The government announces growth figures. The Chancellor talks about turning a corner, and the average British worker earns less, in real terms, than they did in 2008, not less than they expected, less than they actually earned 16 years ago. That gap between what the country produces and what its people keep is not an accident. It is the result of specific decisions made by specific people that transferred the gains of growth away from workers and toward assets. Britain got richer. The British got poorer, and the mechanism that produced that outcome is still running. This is the Wealth Files. Does Britain feel like a country that is getting richer or poorer to you? Drop your answer below. Start with a number that should end the argument before it begins. UK GDP per capita, the output of the economy divided by the number of people in it, is lower today than it was in 2007. Not growing slowly, not recovering. Lower. The United Kingdom is the only G7 economy where the average person produces less value today than they did before the financial crisis. Every other major developed economy, including Italy, including France, including Japan, has recovered and surpassed its pre-crisis level. The UK has not. The Bank of England noticed this in 2011. They named it the productivity puzzle. They have been studying it for 13 years. They still cannot fully explain it. The institution responsible for managing the British economy has spent over a decade unable to explain why the British economy stopped working for the people inside it. That is not a research gap. That is an indictment. When productivity does not grow, wages cannot grow in real terms. That is not ideology. That is arithmetic, and the arithmetic has been running against British workers for 16 years. In 2024, real wages in the United Kingdom, wages adjusted for what they actually buy, remain below their 2008 level. The UK is the only major developed economy where this is true. Below Italy, below Greece, which spent the 2010s in the sovereign debt crisis that required international bailouts and imposed austerity so severe it shrank the economy by 25%. Greece recovered. British workers have not. Meet Laura, secondary school teacher, Birmingham, 15 years in the classroom. Her salary has increased by just over 8% in the past decade. Inflation over the same period, approximately 40%. Laura is not earning less on paper. She is earning significantly less in practice. Less food, less rent, less savings, less future, with the same number on her payslip. She did not make a single financial mistake. The system did not malfunction. It produced exactly what it was designed to produce. Laura absorbed the cost so someone else did not have to. Laura is also paying more tax than any British worker in 70 years. The UK tax burden is currently at its highest level since the early 1950s, which means British workers are contributing more of their income to the state than at almost any point in modern history, and receiving, in return, an NHS with 7 million people on waiting lists, schools that cannot recruit teachers, and infrastructure that a 2024 report described as among the worst maintained in the developed world. The explanation for this is one number. The UK now spends approximately £100 billion per year servicing its national debt, paying interest on what it borrowed. The education budget is £73 billion. Britain is spending more keeping its creditors satisfied than teaching its children. Every pound that goes to debt interest is a pound that does not fix a hospital, does not hire a teacher, does not repair a road. The tax burden is high. The services are collapsing. The money is going somewhere else. The 10% of the British population who can afford to have noticed. Private health insurance in the UK has grown sharply since 2020, now covering approximately 6.8 million people. The people who can afford to leave the NHS waiting list are leaving it, paying twice, once in taxes for a system they can no longer rely on, and again for the private alternative. Two health systems are forming inside one country, one for people who can afford to exit, one for everyone who cannot. That division is not new in British housing. It arrived decades earlier by design. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher introduced Right to Buy, allowing council tenants to purchase their homes at discounts of up to 70% below market value. The policy was sold as the creation of a property-owning democracy. It was genuinely popular. Millions of people bought homes they could not otherwise have afforded. What happened next was not advertised. 40% of the homes sold under right to buy are now owned by private landlords, not by the families who bought them, by investors who purchased them from those families, or from their estates and converted them into rental properties. The council housing stock was sold once at a discount funded by the taxpayer. It is now rented back to people who cannot afford to buy at market rates, with the rent frequently subsidized by housing benefit paid by the taxpayer. The government sold a public asset cheaply, then committed to renting it back indefinitely with public money. The landlord collects both ends. The taxpayer funds both transactions. The person who needs housing pays the rent and builds no equity. That is not an unintended consequence. The outcome was visible within a decade. The policy continued for 40 years. Outside London, the visibility of what Britain has become is harder to avoid. The gap in GDP per capita between London and West Wales, the wealthiest and one of the poorest regions of the UK, is larger than the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the European Union. Inside one country, one currency, one government, the regional inequality of the United Kingdom is not a European problem. It is a developing world problem wearing a G7 name badge. HS2 was the answer. A high-speed rail network connecting London to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, the infrastructure investment that would, the government promised, rebalance the economy and connect the cities left behind by decades of London-centric growth. Then Leeds was removed from the plan, then Manchester, then the northern sections entirely. What remains is a shorter, more expensive version of a line that largely serves London's commuter belt, at a cost that rose from £37 billion to over £100 billion. The regions that were promised connection got the bill. London got the railway. None of this required coordination. It did not require anyone to decide that British workers should earn less, that council housing should become a landlord's subsidy machine, that the North should be promised infrastructure it would never receive. It required only that the people making decisions consistently made decisions that protected the value of what they already held, assets, property, financial instruments, while the costs of those decisions were absorbed by people who held only their labor. The productivity did not grow because investment went to financial services in London, not to the manufacturing base that employed the rest of the country. The real wages did not recover because inflation was allowed to run while wage growth was suppressed to protect corporate margins. The public services collapsed not because the money disappeared, but because it was redirected to service debt accumulated by choices that benefited the asset-owning class. The housing stock was privatized and the cost was socialized. Britain is richer. The measurements say so. The measurements are correct. The British are poorer. Laura's payslip says so. The NHS waiting list says so. The landlord collecting housing benefit on a council house sold at a 70% discount says so. Those two facts are not a contradiction. They are the same fact, seen from two different positions in the same system. The country accumulates. The people absorb. The gains concentrate. The costs distribute. That is not a broken system. That is the system working exactly as the people who built it intended. If this changed how you see the economy you are living inside, the next video goes further. The same pattern, running faster in a country that was supposed to be the model. Hit subscribe. This is the Wealth Files.